Eyes Wide Open is the name of this series for the next 4 messages. And I'm kicking this off today with the thought of hindsight. We're going to be looking at hindsight, insight, foresight, and oversight. So they're the 4 things that we're going to be taking a look at over the next 3 weeks, or 4 weeks. The oversight is at the carol service. But today I'm going to start off with hindsight. And really, we want to pose the question in this series concerning our sight: how perceptive are you? What are you looking at? What do you see and what do you not see? What do we actually see? And the problem, as I see it, is that if we're not careful, we can amble through life and miss things so easily. And our aim in this series is to encourage us to be more aware of seeing things that we don't normally see. In other words, seeing what you don't see. Seeing what you don't see. And so we need to learn to look with our spiritual eyes as well as with our natural eyes. And so that's why we're going to tackle this particular subject. Now, to open up today in the subject of hindsight, I want you to go to 2 verses of Scripture in the book of Isaiah, well known to us, I'm sure. Isaiah 42, verse 9. And then in the next chapter, Isaiah 43, 18 and 19. So 42 and verse 9 says this: "See, the former things have taken place, and new things I declare. Before they spring into being, I announce them to you." Then in the next chapter, 43, 18 and 19, it says this: "Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing." And then it goes on to describe a little bit more about what that is. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. The former things have taken place. Now, hindsight has everything to do with looking in the past. What has gone on before? And I'll start by saying that there are things in the past that are good, and there are things in the past that are not so good, right? Wouldn't you agree with that? Things that we celebrate and remember, and things that we don't ever want to remember again. We don't want to remember our failures, do we, for example? We learn from them, or we like to think we do. And it's interesting to notice here that Satan always wants us to remember our failures. He always wants to tempt us to go back to look at the things where we went wrong. And if we do that, his plan is for us to be limited in our future. So what I want to start by saying today is that we must never allow ourselves to be bound by past failures. We can learn from them, true, but do not let the devil have a field day by letting him get a hold of your mind and restricting you because of things that you have said or done in the past. The past is the past. Today is a new day. And before we go any further, I really believe that there are so many Christians that are bound, and they allow themselves to be bound because they are limiting themselves because of what's happened in the past. If you do that, you're going to be stunted in your growth, and you will never achieve what God has in store for you. Remember the famous saying, if Satan reminds you of your past, you remind him of his future. We've got a great future, guys. Okay. So this starting point is vital. We will not be limited by the past. Rather, let the past be a launching pad into the present and the future. Hindsight, looking back. How many times have you used the phrase "in hindsight" after the event? In other words, you have learned not to make the same mistake again. or else you've taken stock and you've said, well, in hindsight, I would have done things differently. We've all said that, haven't we? How can we learn from hindsight? One of the major obstacles to hindsight and dealing with the past is fear. We'll talk about that in a minute. But for us to successfully possess our tomorrow, we have to deal with the fear of the past. That is a key. So what I'm going to do is open our eyes to the past, learn from the past, not be bound by the past, because we don't want that to limit what God is saying and doing in the future. Now, to give a biblical illustration, I want us to go to Numbers chapter 14. I'm going to read 9 verses, the first 9 verses of Numbers 14. And I'm just going to go through and read it. It's the story of the children of Israel. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly and said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly and gathered there Joshua, son of Nun, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." This is a really interesting part of Israel's history. They were coming to the borders of the promised land for the second time, after 40 years in the wilderness. And God had led them this far, and they had faced what had seemed to be many insurmountable obstacles. But now they were faced with another one. As they were about to go into the land, they knew that there were giants there. They knew that there were great walled cities. They knew that the enemy was too numerous to defeat, and they were beginning to complain and moan and all of that kind of a thing. And they were faced with a difficult situation. And of course, this was the first time in Scripture here when they were coming to the land. But the fact is, when they came again in Deuteronomy, they came with the same premise. But on this first occasion, they said, "Let's go back. Let's go back to the past. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's not go forward into the land that God has given to us." Now, as a church here, Sheffield Christian Life Centre, do you know we are in exactly the same situation? We've been on a journey. And we're almost on the verge of reaching the next part of our journey into the promised land. The promised land, incidentally, is a type of the Spirit-filled life. The Spirit-filled life is an adventure. It's moving from one place to another place to another place, seeing a greater expression of God, okay? The fulfillment of all of that is the eternity of heaven as we will understand it. But we're on a journey, taking new territory, taking new ground. And all the way along, we will face new obstacles. And this next part of our journey is the obstacle of getting the Life Centre up and running, getting it renovated, and so on. And the biggest obstacle for us is not getting it done, but the finances needed to get it done. It's a massive obstacle. Actually, in the natural, it seems an impossible task. It may be in your personal life, never mind the church, but in your personal life, you're facing an unsurmountable obstacle. Well, let's look at what we can learn here. Because interesting, in the middle of this situation, in Numbers 14, the congregation, after the leadership of Moses and Aaron and Miriam, only 2 people stood up in the mass of probably around 2 million people estimated, 600,000 men we know, besides women and children. And they began to speak about what God had wanted them to do. It was Joshua and Caleb. And in verses 6 and 9, we read it, how that they tore their clothes and says, come on, we can do this. We've explored the land. God has given us the land. He's promised us the land. And we can go in and we can take this. Interestingly, people don't very often go with the minority, do they? But this wasn't a democratic vote as to whether the whole congregation agreed with God or not. Right? People don't often go with the minority. And I'm not sure we have that same situation here at all, actually. But whether the whole congregation agreed with God or not, that is still the case. Now, God has led us this far as a church. It's amazing that we've got this far. When you start to look back to see how God has led us, it has been fantastic. Hasn't it? God has clearly spoken to us through prophecy, through circumstance, through miraculous provision, for us to be able to get as far as that we have. And so, I'm going to make a statement here. We're going to possess the land. And I know you're with me, but I'm making a declarational statement here. We're going to possess the land. We're going to take it. And no matter how big an obstacle is faced before us, our God is bigger than every mountain and every obstacle in our way. We have heard the word of the Lord, but there are lessons we can learn from this passage that will encourage us into possessing our next phase of God's purposes and plans for our lives. So I'm going to look at 5 things this morning, and the first is this. With regard to hindsight, we forget so often what God has done. We forget so often what God has done. The Israelites had forgotten about the miracles. They'd started to complain. They'd started to moan. In verses 1 to 3 here, the first part of verse 3, here was this groaning, moaning congregation, moaning about things that weren't the way they wanted them to be. And Satan keeps bringing impossibilities and negativities into our minds. And what we need to remind ourselves is how we've got this far. The children of Israel forgot what God had already done for them. We need to be very careful that we do not forget what God has already done. Let's just remind ourselves for a minute, because let's make these statements. If we do this, it's going to really encourage us, okay? What has God said? Well, God said he's going to give us a palace. Remember Peter Butt's prophecy? God is going to give you a palace. Well, what is the Life Center? What did it used to be known as? The Picture Palace. Coincidence? Oh, well, maybe. Maybe that one is a coincidence. Let's just put that there then. Keith Hazel said, you're going to have a building that's got some blue doors on it. Have you noticed what color doors are on the back of the building? Blue. Oh, maybe another coincidence. Let's just put, okay, so there's 2 coincidences there. Then we had another prophecy about pray for the man with the keys. Do you remember when we were purchasing the building? I haven't got time to go into all of that. Some of you know the story, how God provided a caretaker for the building on our behalf, actually. We didn't know that at the time. The building was being sold by the auctioneers, and the company went into administration, and so they hired a company to caretake the building whilst the sale was going through the auction. And this company had appointed a guy called Alex, who lived in Doncaster, to be the man with the keys. Terence and I had met him. Terence met him once, I met him 3 times. And just an amazing guy, and he was the one that opened up the building for all people to see who wanted to look at purchasing it and all that kind of a thing. And then on one occasion, I just felt like I needed to go and pray. So I was praying around the building, walked around the block, laid hands on the building, walked down the bottom, was coming up the hill, past where Andy and Janine used to live. It was about not far from your old house, just past there. And the Lord says, pray the prophecies. And one of the prophecies was that God was going to give us a building on a hill. Guess where this building is? Oh, that's another coincidence. Okay, let's come back to the man with the keys. So I walked, and the Lord says, what about the man with the keys? I said, oh, yes, Lord. Alex, the guy with the keys, I want to pray for him. Lord, I don't know what favor this is. I said, but Lord, just... So I walked to the top of the road. I was just on my way to a trustees meeting in Dorset at the time, but I felt I needed to pray and pray over the building. And when I got to the front door, who was there but Alex with the keys? So I said, well, what are you doing here? Now remember, he lives in Doncaster. I've had no contact with him. And his words were these. He said this. He says, well, I've come to open up the building for you. I said, well, he said, well, that's right. And I said, yeah, absolutely. So he said, well, look, you know the score. Here's my torch. Here's the keys. He said, I'm going to sit in my car. Take as long as you like. So what I did was I went everywhere. I went in the roof void. I went in the basement. I prayed over every wall. I was in there for about 3/4 of an hour, praying like mad, coming out and stuff. And I said, so how did you know how to come? He said, well, somebody told me I had to come to open up for you. Well, that somebody must have been an angel, because I never made that conversation, right? Actually, I told him, do you know what, Alex, we've been praying for you for 10 years. What he said? Do you remember the story? Okay, another coincidence. What about the prophecy? God's going to give us a building 3 times the size for half the price. Well, we haven't got time to go into the definition of all of these, but you remember what we bought the building for? I hadn't told anybody what my maximum was going to be when I bid in this auction, but it was 410,000. Actually, we got 406,000 absolute max, and I thought, well, I'll put another 4,000 on my credit card. I'll go to 410, and we got it for 205. Let me tell you something. Those were not coincidences. Those were the fulfillment of the prophetic word. When God had spoken, he fulfilled his word. It's too big a deal for it to be a coincidence. This is God's building. That's it. Let's remind ourselves about the purchase. How it all came about. The word of the Lord came to me whilst I was in Zambia. Yvonne told me about the building coming up for auction, and God gave me a word from Exodus 13 whilst I was in Zambia. I haven't time to go into it. It was a miracle that we were able to get the necessary finances together within 6 weeks, which included a mortgage. It was a miracle. It's not a coincidence. It was a miracle. We had favor with Kingdom Bank. We had favor with the auctioneers. Did you know that the auctioneers, Mark Jenkinson and Son, they knew that we wanted it. They're a Christian company, or they go to different churches. And Adrian Little, who was dealing with the auction, we spoke to him beforehand and everything. He says, well, I know you want the building. I just, wish you the best and everything. He says, but it's a level playing field ultimately. The one that comes up with the most money wins. That's it. It's as simple as that. There's nothing we can do about it. After the auction, when we'd done the deal, went to see the auctioneers, he came up and he said this. He says, well, we're thrilled that you've got it. As you know, we're Christians, and we prayed in the office, in the back, that you would get that building. Isn't that amazing? Coincidence? No, it's the favor of God. The favor of God. What about provision along the way? We've had, the asbestos was a real big hit, right? Spend £70,000 on getting rid of rubbish. And we spent more because we've got rid of a load more rubbish, actually. But the asbestos alone was ridiculous. It was a massive mountain, but God has provided. God has provided us with the right builders, the right architects, and so on. Incidentally, remember, January the 8th, we're going to have a great service where the builders and the architects and that will come in here. We're going to pray over them and bless them. They're going to share a little bit. January the 8th. You do not want to miss January the 8th. It's going to be a great vision day, okay? All of that, I'm saying all of that because we are celebrating the provision of God. Never forget what God has done. God has brought us this far, not to leave us in the lurch. The danger is that we can so often forget how we have got to this place today. Yes, we go through periods of financial insecurity in the natural. We're in the middle of that right now. And we ask the question, well, how are we going to meet the needs? How are we going to survive with no financial security? How many of you have asked that question yourselves in your own personal lives? Right? We're doing an amazing job here, you know. Or rather, God is doing an amazing job providing for us in the kingdom with no guarantee of financial security, yet God has provided. We're all alive. We're all here. The bills are paid so far. But I have absolute confidence that God is still on the throne, still providing, and still making the way possible, no matter how big the mountain. Right, Luke? You know, it's a life of faith. You don't get faith. Faith is a dangerous thing to get involved with, and it's risk. But it's not risk when you are believing God, because God is our confidence. God has not led us this far without providing for the future. This is the church testimony. This is our testimony. We need to celebrate what God has done. What about your personal faith? If we had time, which we don't have today, we could tell of numerous stories of how God has provided for you. Right? Incidentally, yesterday the contracts arrived for the sale of this, so everything's beginning to work through. We've got a load of things to get on with doing, so things are rolling. Okay, I'll have more to tell you in a couple of weeks' time once I've talked to a few people. But things are beginning to roll rather quickly. So there's a sense of anticipation here, okay? But obviously there's a time when we can say some things and we can't say some of the other things because of the way negotiations work and everything. But God is at work. Things are bubbling. There's things that we need to do. We've got to get rid of the rubbish. I'm still constantly reminded of Nehemiah. The first thing he did before he rebuilt the walls was he removed the rubbish. We've got more rubbish to remove. Come on, guys. Chip in and help. You know, every bit helps. Every bit is needed. And so this is what we need to do, testify of God's miraculous provision. The danger is that when we face another obstacle, if we start to moan and groan and complain, just like the children of Israel did, then we start to go backwards. The children of Israel forgot what God had done for them. They forgot. How can you forget this? They had miraculous provision of food every single day. Well, 6 days out of 7. They had to collect twice as much on the 6th day for the 7th. I mean, they didn't even have to go shopping to Aldi. They just walked out their front door and there was breakfast. It was there. Every day for 40 years. How is that possible with 2 million people? What about water? You know, water is vital. To get enough water for 2 million people, let me tell you, that's a fair bit of water. But they never, ever went without. And even when it seemed as if the mountain was before them, water came out of a rock. God provided. But the Israelites forgot. They forgot about the crossing of the Red Sea and how miraculously God parted those waters. They forgot. And so now they were before the promised land. They were coming and they were worried about the giants and the walled cities, and there was this mountain of unbelief before them, but they had forgotten how God had led them this far. Let us never, ever forget what God has done. The second thing is that the temptation to go back is a constant one. Verses 3a and 4 here of Numbers 14. We read it earlier, how the children of Israel said, let's go back to Egypt. And this is something that we fight against constantly. Every one of us will face this experience. And one reason we are tempted to revisit the past is because there is a security in being comfortable with doing what we've always done. Yeah, that's right. You know, how many times have you heard people say, talking about the past. I remember when. Isn't that annoying? I remember the good old days. Oh, it never used to be like this in our day. Right? Actually, thank God for the good old days. We celebrate past victories, but because God did something one way in the past, in a certain way, is no guarantee that he's going to do the same thing today in the same way. God says from the word that I read, see, I am doing a new thing. In fact, God tells us to forget the past. God is constantly doing new things. Change is here to stay. All of us will be tempted to go back instead of moving forward. All of us have thought things like, well, I was better off with my old job. I was more at peace when I was on my own. Come on, ladies. Some of you have even been tempted to think I was better off living in that other city where I was brought up, or the other country where I lived. You know, the grass is never greener on the other side of the fence. Look at all those experiences that are a part of our life. They were good times, yes. But let me tell you something. We are not living in the past. We are living in 2016. How many of you have had a great holiday? It was so great you think, well, let's do that again. Let's go there next year. You go there next year and it's never the same. Different people, different ambience, different atmosphere. Now, I'm not saying never go back to the same place and revisit the same place. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is time moves on and today is not yesterday. Some of us can be tempted to think what could have been if we had made different decisions. Do you know what? You can be bound for the rest of your life if you live with what could have been. You've got to change that language to say what will be instead of what could have been. Last month I was in Canada, in Arborg, in a town in Manitoba, preaching in a church. I shared a little bit about it, about 300 people in that church. Great church, very similar situation to where we're at. And the pastor is part of an engineering family, and he showed me around. He works a couple of days a week in the factory, actually. And his dad, who is in his 80s, still works there, potters around and stuff. And I think they had something like about 120 people or something working for them. 2 factories, and I went around both of them. And it was high-tech engineering stuff with all kinds of mills and lathes and high-tech stuff. It's just phenomenal. And the point of me saying all of this, he says to me, he said, would you like to go and visit the factory? I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So here I am in Arborg on my own. I'd been, they put me in this hotel to stay, and then he picked me up, went for breakfast, and so I was praying about our building, praying about the vision, praying, Lord, where's the money coming from? Is it going to work? You know, we go through all of that, and I have to say, I believe in you, God. We have to consciously speak these things out. Every one of us will be tempted to have negative thoughts, right? But we refuse to entertain them. So I'm refusing all of this. And then Satan dropped something in my mind. He said, you know what, Phil, are you really making it as a leader? What have you really done? What have you really accomplished? What have you really seen happen? Are you just saying things for saying them's sake? Do you know what? This is the devil. So here we go to this engineering factory. Now, when I was at school, the age of 16, I had the opportunity to go into engineering, and I had 6 apprenticeships offered me from different engineering companies, and I chose the one at Rolls-Royce, Aero Engines Division at Parkside in Coventry. So I was going into engineering to do an apprenticeship, and that was my lot in life. That's what I felt I wanted to do. I was good at metal work and everything. And as soon as I walked into this factory, and I saw the iron filings, I don't know whether there's a certain smell, like it's the raw smell of metal. You know what I mean? If you go into a timber yard, there's the smell of timber. If you go into B&Q, there's a hardware smell. If you go into Greg's cake shop, there's there's a certain smell. But let me tell you something. The smell was a part of me. It was a part of my past. It was a part of the engineering in me and the devil was saying, you see, you could have been doing this. You could have made a lot of money. You could have been engineering. You could have been involved. And I was having to go on the lathes and milling and doing all of this. It was great fun and everything. And thousands pounds worth of equipment, and millions actually. It was just an amazing situation. And the devil was saying, you could have done this. You could have gone there. But I want to say something. I chose not to do that. I chose a different path. I chose to be a preacher and a church leader, and I have absolutely no regrets. No regrets. But the danger is to go back, to visit the past. What would have been, what could have been, instead of saying, this is the way that I'm going forward. If Satan tempts you and tells you to give up and to go back, you want to say, I know whom I have believed. And I am persuaded that he is able. You have heard the voice of God, and you have chosen the path to serve him. Let's do it with confidence and with passion and with excitement that brings us into fulfillment right where we are. You know, some people, they move from place to place, never actually fitting in. And they do that because they either walk with a grievance, they carry a grievance with them, or they struggle with submission to the will of God and to his delegated authorities. The reason why some people just don't stick in one church is because they don't like to be told what to do. They want to do their own thing. God has given delegated authority. We need to submit to that. Even Jesus submitted to his delegated authority. Okay? And you know, if you only ever do what you want to do, you're going to be like Cain in Genesis 4, and you'll be a vagabond, a restless wanderer going through the earth. Don't entertain going back to the past. Live for today where God has called you. None of us have come here today to go back. We're here to go forward. Somebody, the thought came to me when I was in prayer last week, why don't we just sell that building and just make do with what we've got? That's the enemy. That's contrary to the word that God has given to us. So I had to rebuke that in the name of Jesus. We're going to get more of these attacks, let me tell you. Our destiny is the land beyond Jordan, not here, this side of Jordan. We have to cross Jordan. And our next Jordan, here in the Sheffield Christian Life Centre, is the Life Centre, the building. We're not going to stand still. We're not going to revisit the past. The call is set before us. Number 3. I think the one before that 7 has gone. Should say 17, not 7. I'm sure I've not been that long. Flipping heck. Okay. Remember past victories to be encouraged for the future. You know, there are some things in the past we need to celebrate and remember, like I said already. There are some victories, there are deliverances. We were born again. We need to remember that, our salvation. We remember the prophetic word. We remember what God has said. We remember the deliverances. Absolutely. A couple of months ago, Ian Ward gave me this book to read. It's The Climb, Chris Froome, the Tour de France winner. It's a fantastic book. I recommend anybody to read that. And it's the memoir of Chris Froome and his experiences of growing up in the dusty roads of Kenya and getting to the height of winning the Tour de France. And in 2015, he won it for the second time. That's when he wrote this book. He won it again this year. He's won it 3 times. And from a skinny, introvert boy cycler to the wearer of the yellow jersey, it's a thrilling and engaging and inspiring account of what can be achieved through the years of toil. And as I read this book, it really inspired me. I was in the dentist last week, and they always ask me, where have you been? I just got back from India, and they can't take it all in. I said, so what I was doing there and everything. And the dental nurse didn't normally say much, but she was talking to me. She said, well, what a question. Where do you get your inspiration from? So here I'm in the dentist chair, so I start to preach to them. So they know me now. And in fact, the dentist, he lives north of Sheffield, and he passes the Life Centre every day, and he asks about it all the time. Anyway, that's another thing. So I said, well, I go to conferences, I listen to inspirational talks, preachers, and I read books, and I just told him about this book. I said, but really my inspiration is God. He's my inspiration. So then I'm in preaching mode, So he said, I think we better do your tooth now, Phil. So but it really encouraged me and it inspired me. It talks about being humble and developing a passion and a determination to overcome whatever obstacle. It's a brilliant inspirational book. I recommend you read it. Yes, visit past victories, but don't celebrate them for themselves only. Don't try to relive them. What is past is past. Enjoy the victory as a launching pad for a new experience. Celebrate the past, but only as a victory that will inspire us for the future. Number 4, let's believe the promises of God. Can you slow the clock down just a little bit? It's one thing talking about what God has said, but it's another thing to act in faith and do something about what God has said. The opposite to belief is unbelief. And disbelieving God and what he has said is actually living in rebellion to God. And this is what the Israelites were beginning to do. They actually started to physically rebel. And rebellion starts with a negative thought, but it develops into a negative action. When I was 8, my brother was 7. We might have been a little old, might have been 8 and 9. My parents sent us to piano lessons. And we went to the strictest, most dangerous, fearsome lady piano teacher on the face of the earth called Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Williams was a frightening person. I was scared to death of her. She shouted at me, she scolded me, and I hated it, hated going. And we used to go on every Saturday morning. First half hour was me, and the second half hour was Paul, and we were doing our scales and all this, and rapped over the knuckles and all kinds of stuff. She was very, very strict. In the end, I got fed up with this. I said, Paul, I don't want to go today. He says, no, I don't. So we ran through it. So we never went for 2 weeks. And I'm thinking, we'll just say we had measles or something. So 3 weeks later, my dad got hold of me and says, what's going on? Mrs. Williams had phoned up to say, well, I haven't seen your boys. We just went as if we were normally going, and then we went to the park and played on the swings and stuff, until it was time to go home. We didn't think we'd get caught, but we got caught. Well, that was one of a couple of occasions when Dad really went mad at me. But the fact of the matter is I rebelled. And the greatest pain, the greatest joy of any parent is to give. Christmas is a great time for that. The greatest pain of any parent is to see your children experience failure, and especially when they rebel. That hurts. That really hurts. It's no different between God and us. When we rebel, God is hurt. God hurts when we don't believe in his promises, when we entertain fear and doubt. God has promised to lead us. He's promised the power of the Holy Spirit. He's promised to provide for us, verses 7 to 9. Let me encourage you to believe the promises of God and speak them into being. My last point is dealing with fear. If we believe the promises of God, then fear has no place in our lives. Allowing fear to grip us will nullify the prophetic word of God in our lives. Now, we all experience fear, but the question is, what do we do when fear attacks us? See, when we have fear, we become numb. We freeze. And it makes us incapable of moving any further. How many times have you been stunted in your spiritual growth because of fear? Whether it's the fear of man, the fear of the unknown, the fear of failure, the fear of the future. Paul said to Timothy, you have not been bound with a spirit of fear, spirit of timidity, but you've been given a sound mind, 2 Timothy 1:7. God has not given us a spirit of fear. He's given us boldness and courage. And he's saying, do not fear. One more illustration, and after this, I'll call the band up. There was a very sad era in the history of the United States. In the 1930s was the Great Depression. In 1933, in this major economic recession, when the whole country was bound with fear, actually, it was the inauguration speech of the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And this is what he said in his inauguration speech. He said, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, and will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief," now watch this, "my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Fear will cause us to stay in the past. But belief in God and confidence in God will propel us into the future. We must not fear the unknown future. Instead, God will lead us and advance us with confidence because God will lead us." That's what Joshua and Caleb said here. You know, we have a reverential fear of God. We do not fear the schemes of the evil one. We declare that the only one we fear is our Master and Savior, Jesus Christ. And that's not a terrifying fear. It's a fear of respect. It's a fear of honor and a belief that God is alone. Let's have the band up. So, the Lord will lead us forward. Don't be tempted to go back to the past, but let's move forward with excitement and with faith and with confidence. You know, Moses actually was not the leader of the children of Israel. God was. I am not the real leader of this church. Jesus Christ is. Jesus is the foundation of our faith. He is the reason for our faith. Let's not forget to celebrate what God has already done. Thank God. Look where we've come. Do not be tempted to go back to the past. Look back to the past for encouragement to the future, but don't live in the past. Let's believe the promises of God, because if we believe them, then we need to act on them. And then finally, do not be bound by fear. Let's move forward from the past and use hindsight as a foundation for us to move into our destiny. We've got great things ahead for us, church. Not only corporately as a church, but individually. We've all got our mountains to overcome.